Series 3 of Airs for Architecture begins with a remarkable conversation I got to have with Denise Scott-Brown, one of the truly great lights of 20th century architecture. The episode, ostensibly organised around two pieces of Denise's work, Architecture as Signs and Systems for a Mannerist Time, published by Harvard University Press in 2004, and an essay entitled Studio, Architecture's Offering to Academe, published in the ARPA Journal in 2016. As it happens, the episode decides another path, as Denise discusses her early life, education, travel, influences, friends, teachers and acquaintances. It's really quite a story. Have a listen.
A's for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
So the way I normally do this is I say sort of hello and welcome, and then I ask you to kind of introduce yourself. And it's a little bit absurd asking you to introduce yourself because you're architectural royalty and everybody knows who you are. But maybe we could carry on in that fashion anyway. Is that all right? So you could self-define in that very modern...
Yes, I can do that. And I've been thinking of defining in a way as redefining as well, because I have all sorts of reputations. And now at the end of my life, putting things together, I can say things I wouldn't have said when I first came from South Africa to England, or when I first went from Europe to America, that I would say now. And one of them is, I'm Denise, and I'm happy that it seems to be the world of architecture calls me Denise. And when there was the Pritzker petition, and people wrote in and said all sorts of things about how difficult it was to be a young architect anywhere in the world, and how difficult they saw my position was. There was no one in that thing who called me anything other than Denise, and I was very proud of that. And so that's, you'll see in the latest book that came out, half of the people call me Scott-Brown, because you talk about all architects now by their surnames. And then there's two people at the very end called me Denise. One was one of my students. He's now 84, and he was a planning student, not an architect, and he was a real bad boy. And I really took him down and bawled him out. That's not behavior for graduate school. That's not behavior for undergraduate school. It's not even behavior for high school. And he had a thesis in this article, which only a planner could have written, and it's fascinating. So that's the universal Denise from one person, and the other one is the one who left from our office, who's working with our new office now, run by other people, but he's still working with me. And he also calls me Denise in that book.
Is it okay?
So
is it okay if I call you the universal Denise?
Ask some other people whether they feel it. But you see, there is universality too. And I start out I'm a British subject born in Northern Rhodesia.
Mm-hmm.
And then at 2 years old, we go to South Africa, which is where my father was from. Mm-hmm. My parents are from Eastern Europe. My grandfather on my father's side probably was born in Ukraine. And recently, this kid who's now in Ukraine making movies of the revolt there, the one who, when I said to him, weren't you mad when I told you you were not suitable for this and not, he looked at me and he said, Denise, I knew what I was doing. So he was taking the mickey out of me all the time. So anyway, planning school is like that. It's much more lovable than architecture school. Mm-hmm. They're much less brittle. They're much more involved. So anyway,
but maybe we can go back to that your upbringing in Southern Africa, and you talked about this so when you called me, which I have bragged about a lot to a lot of people, to be called by Denise Scott-Brown on your mobile phone is a privilege indeed. You suggested two pieces of work that we might talk around. You suggested architecture as science and systems, for a modern for a Mannerist time, which was written at the beginning of the millennium, wasn't it? About 2003.
Yes.
And you suggested another paper that you'd written in mass context called "Studio: Architecture's Offering to Academy." And I thought
I didn't say academy, I said academe.
well, you know, my mispronunciation can go quite badly wrong, and I apologize.
No, that's all right. Academe is a very much used frame statement in America for the whole way of teaching in a university as opposed to a high school or an office or somewhere else.
Okay.
See, and what is innate in academe, and trying to take what is innate there and saying what is innate in architecture that academe could use.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that, but I did wonder. You started off. So the book is co-written with Robert Venturi, and who's obviously your husband. I wondered if we could start with this moment that you start in your section of the book, talking about your background in this beautiful modernist house, but set within a Southern African context which is decidedly distinct from it.
Yes, but you know, that's not the start of the story. The start of the story is 1903, when my grandparents leave Latvia. And for all the reasons, Jews left Eastern Europe, including 15 years of forced labor in the army. You see, things like that, including being killed. But so the point is, one left and went to South Africa and started trying to improve himself to bring back this near-starving family in Latvia, and immediately got yellow fever and died. And then my grandfather went to German Southwest Africa because they were from Courland. They were German-speaking. Courland is part of Latvia. It had a French princess and the Duke of Courland. So they were sort of proud of not speaking Yiddish. I think they shouldn't have been proud, but they were. But they then got themselves to Africa. And that was not to South Africa, it was to the Rhodesias, as they were called then, to what is now Zambia. And then they lived in Lion country. And the beginning of my cultural background is them making everything that they had to live with. Almost like my grandmother being deftly trained as a cultured young lady in Latvia, to do sewing and to know housekeeping and no cooking. She had to teach herself Jewish cooking in Africa. And I use this to teach my planning students. I say, where would my grandmother have bought a pickled herring in Lion country outside of Bulawayo? You see, I get them thinking about the fact that we were not colonials in the usual way. We were what's called carpetbaggers, and we didn't support the army and we were not engineers in the mines or anything like that. We were setting up little stores and selling things to local people, black and white. That's what my dad did. Left university at 18 in Johannesburg, disappointing his mother no end. Went up north, as they called it, lived this life. Sounds a bit like California among 49ers. Indeed, my grandfather dressed that way, very elegantly, stovepipe pants, a la American 100 years before. And he's seen in pictures with a mud house, which is where he lives. He's lucky he's just not living under a tree at that point.
Yes.
And so all of that is very much part of how I look at popular culture, pop art, and things like that. But then I go on and I get to Johannesburg, and then there's a whole new social environment there. And I'm 4 when I get there, and we build this house. My mother had been an architecture student, paid for by one of my grandmother's brothers. And she fell in with a group who were in touch with Le Corbusier. And there's a letter to them. One of them then went to England and taught most of his life there. And I keep on forgetting the name. Norman Hansen. Hansen, Tomkin and Finkelstein was the firm that designed, and Norman Hansen was the designer. And it was a beautiful house.
Mm.
And I have all these childhood memories, and I say I became an architect at the age of 2 when I went to that land with my parents, and they had blueprints. They were actually blue with white lines.
Mm.
And you saw them, I saw them looking up at these prints and saying, well, this would be here, that would be there. And I was very involved from then on. And when we lived in the house, and I knew where northeast was, which of course is where the sun is in that hemisphere. And my mother came in and opened looking out at the east and sang to us. Of course, it was so beautiful there. And I could describe the house too. But mainly I had my childhood steps of self-improvement in that house. It wasn't a traditional house where the door could be opened by a 3-year-old. I had to wait till I was 5 years old to reach about 4 foot high and open a steel lever handle door, which is modern. And so that's when I could open a door, and so on like that. And I have all sorts of visual memories of that kind that I say were the beginning of what I call thought vectors. When you have those kinds of memories and ideas, you see them going along in the pathway of your life. And so that's one thing to say. The other was everyone who could flee from Germany fled from Germany before the doors were closed and locked and you couldn't get out. And so, first of all, the first flights were in the 1890s and before, but then there's the flights for World War II. And there were so many people who escaped from Nazism who were living in South Africa, teaching us in school. There were ones whose degrees didn't count in South Africa, but they were also musicians. They became music teachers, art teachers, and they just surrounded us with European views of Africa and me with a critique of their views. And the most influential to me was a woman called Rosa van Gelderen, Dutch Jewish, and she established a school for kids to go after school and paint what they liked. She merely gave big things of paper and big paintbrushes and poster paint, bright colors. And then she said, do what you like. But she didn't really. She said, you will not be creative artists if you don't paint what's around you. Las Vegas, are you calling me? You see, I got that from her. But I also got to go and paint in the felt. And then I found she was wrong, because all those artists who came with this idea that of the noble, savage, and happy Black people, I began to see there were other painters who were painting unhappy Black people doing difficult things. And that, again, and my university was very, very anti-racism. They were the most liberal university, Witwatersrand University, famous for that. And they spread all over the world. I've found someone heading the medical school at Penn who was from Wits University, but they're all over. So those were the people who, my next big influences was me, a structural engineer who taught us, who was from Germany. And then, and they became, they were mentors and teachers and full of love. So it's collegial love that's making these thought processes come out. So those are the ones from Africa. I get more from England and Italy, and I worked in Italy for 6 months. I studied in England at the AA, 1952 to 1955. Went to Italy and then also went all over Europe and also to Israel and parts of the Middle East. And then went back home and saw my family through other eyes, the eyes of all these other things. And so it all adds to this building of thought that you discovered me talking about halfway or 2/3 of the way through in that architecture, science and systems. You've seen a bit of that there. By the way, everyone thinks Bob went to the American Academy and there he learned about mannerism. And it's just not true. Bob, 12 days before he left, found some architectural historians, probably from the British Academy, and they and some Americans went to see the architecture of a living mannerist, and he saw these paintings of, or rather these buildings of Brazzini. Never seen any mannerism. He was looking at as all self-respecting young Americans were, Georgian architecture, and I did too, and we all did, and he got to know about the Pilgrim's Way and things like that. But suddenly there he was looking at something, and he said, "I haven't found anything I could learn from really yet. Here it is, Brazzini, Nazi." But anyway, forget about that. He was a Mannerist architect, and he did some very fascinating buildings. Then Bob gets back to America, and he starts looking for people at Penn who know about Mannerism, and there aren't any. He found one working in the office of Saarinen, and that was why do I keep? He was one who became my good friend too, Kevin Roach, and he was English, he was Irish actually, and he was the only one who knew about the things that we were all looking at in England. All those phrases around a mannerism, binary systems, three columns, not four columns. So it was two spaces. Bad thing to do in composition, the thing we did. If people think it's bad, we do it. Space is too narrow, space is too high. And we were the ones going and looking at all the Mannerist buildings.
Maybe you can could you define mannerism as you read it, perhaps? Like how are you interpreting mannerism?
Well,
I know that Robert was very keen on Michelangelo, and uses Michelangelo to kind of describe what he sees as being mannerism, which is, as I understand it, essentially rule breaking.
It's more than rule breaking. It's that see, in the first place, if you are a functionalist, you believe that that form is derived from needs and requirements. And you believe that it's brave to break rules if necessary to meet needs. And then there's also someone who believes in social concern. And there's a wonderful description of an architectural historian called Dora Jane, someone I forget who, and she says there's a small corner in heaven reserved for artists who believe in social concern in the arts. And Bob and I stepped bravely into those categories, both of those categories, but not wholly into them. You see, these were things that could make your architecture more exciting, more relevant, more fun, and made you search more. And they gave you a guide, but also this growth of ideas related to that. So mannerism was also that. And then Bob would say, following people like that, he also followed someone called Donald Drew Egbert in Princeton. And from him, he learned, again, social concern in the arts and was a keen follower of that, partly because his mother was a pacifist. And she walked to school hungry when she was a little girl, being Italian. So he got all these influences. I found that she and my grandmother both had the same book in their library, two of the same books, believe it or not. The one was The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism by George Bernard Shaw. They both believed highly in him. The other one was Mein Kampf, both of them in German, because Nirvana didn't have Mein Kampf. The lady who built this house had Mein Kampf. She was quarter Jewish. She had Mein Kampf and she hid it in the closet, and my grandmother had it too. My grandmother also read Freud and all the German socialists around the First World War. Robert Scott Brown's great uncle was a Jewish journalist in England called the Jewish foreign minister. And he wrote a lot. His name, you find them in every Jewish encyclopedia. His name is Lucian Wolff. And when I met Isaiah Berlin in London, and we went to dinner at the Sainsbury's, and we were all talking there, I was talking about my family, and he was saying, this is the best dinner I've had in a long time. And it wasn't because Prince Charles was there, it's because I was there telling him about things he knew. But the point was, he had just given the Lucian Wolff Memorial Lecture just before he met us. And so, and we'd gone to visit Lucian's wife, and she was Catholic and ardent nothing, she put it. But she told us all about his diplomatic life and the way he worked. And also, he was a great lover of architecture. And he dressed in top coats and high hats and kid gloves. And he went to look at the biggest hotel in the shtetl where my family were living. And they would be with noses pressed to the door. Can this posh person be part of us? So I'm full of all those backgrounds as well. And where does that, and then I'm working with those same people as lab assistants in physics and things like that. And then when I went to Germany, I found myself on a bus. I'd had a terrible time in post-war Germany. If any Germans spoke with American accents, they were going to try to make a pass at you, and worse. Come and stay at our place. It's free. The hostel you'll have to pay for. Come and stay with me. And I was going crazy with all of this. And then I get on the bus, and there's the conductor. And I've given the money. He says in English, "You've given me Swiss money." So I just knew that, yeah, take whatever you need. So he takes out the German money. This is what you need. He says, and by the way, I can speak English. And I'm not a bus conductor. I'm a student of law. And I said, I've heard that one before. And he says, can I show you round Bonn? Tomorrow morning, you could come and have breakfast with me and my auntie and my sister. I think his parents were in place for correction of Nazis. I suspect that's why I didn't meet them. A pretty little sister and a nice aunt and very respectable middle class people. So we did that. And then at a certain point, we found where there'd been a plan of a church, and now it was just in the cobblestones of a new street. And he said, what religion are you? And I didn't want to bring up that whole argument, so I ignored him. But then he came, and I got back, I got a letter. I was living in England then, I was at the AA. And he said, can we have a pen pal correspondence? And I said, I have nothing to say to you as a Jew. And then I got a 30-page letter. And then we began a long friendship, which involved going to Spain, the two of us, and a friend of his, a theology student. And then later, an American they found hitchhiking through Spain, falling apart. He'd graduated from Columbia. He was a photographer, and he was big and tall, and he was taking pictures in the markets in Spain. And he was a student of Cartier-Bresson. And also, he never talked about being Jewish, but when you called his mama, he certainly was. And then, but later he did lots of photographs of Jews, but then he was being Cartier-Bresson. I learned a whole lot from him. So we traveled all the way around Spain talking about how could I talk to them. And it was very interesting. And English students and German students were so different. And they became fast friends. And then I went back to South Africa, and I went straight to Manfred Marcus, my structures teacher. Now, if you were puzzled by structures, and young women were, because there were no science teachers left to teach sciences in girls' schools, they couldn't find enough for boys' schools. So I had a tough time getting to understand. And so I went to him, and he had an office right near the school, and you could bring your sandwich, and you could go for a free tuition with Manfred, particularly if you're a pretty girl, and get help about understanding structures. So I go there to Manfred, and soon I'm talking not about need for structure in his class, but need for structure in my life. By that time, he's very interested in this earnest young woman. And he is very, he didn't laugh. He just, be patient. You'll have it. And then I said, and I've got another problem. What's that? I can't love Brahms. German students, German professors, they have their students to supper, their best students. So he got all the ones good at engineering, and then he got me, and I was good at design. And he just loved that. So now he says, be patient about Brahms. One day you'll love him. He's right.
Do you? Because I can't love Brahms either.
Well, anyway, the point is now I get the emotion. I couldn't deal with the emotion then. And when I could do that, but I still love Bach. I love Bach. So anyway, then I came back from Europe, and I'd been talking to Kurt and Hans Martin and Len. And I went straight into the structures class, but I sat at the back because I wasn't at Litz anymore. So he looks up and he says, when it welcome to a young woman who shouldn't be here, and he just beams. And so after the lecture, I said, I have to ask you about these friends I made. And I told him that whole story. And he said, I was not brave, but when I was there were people passing out leaflets which said, buy so-and-so's shoes. And you opened it and it said, fight the Nazis. I was not brave enough to do that. And I left. He said, but there were people who, I had a friend who was a gym teacher. That's simple English way of putting it. And here they say physical education, phys ed, but a gym teacher. And he was invited to come and bring his skills to the Nazi party. And he said, of course I won't do that. That's ridiculous. And he said, Manfred said, you fool. The moment you write a letter saying, so sorry, my health will not permit me, you'll have to leave the country. And that's what he said. And then when I talked to the Germans, they said, our parents didn't dare talk to us. We were told to betray them and they would have been killed. People said, we can't all leave and go to Switzerland. Someone's got to be back, or to Sweden. Someone's got to be back here. And they just put their head down. One of them, his father was a principal of a big public school, meaning government school. Public school in America means a prep school in America. Public school in England, it's not that. It's a government school. But it was one known for its scholastic excellence and known for taking and training working class kids to be able to join it. And so you could imagine what he was like. I went and stayed with those families. It was fascinating and it was really fun. We designed a house for one of them, and I came back and found they'd built it, Robert Scott Brown and I. So here's the whole background I bring to America. And then I get to America and...
How did you get to America? Did you just apply after the AA, or did you get a scholarship? I mean, how did that work? Why did you decide on America?
Well, you see, you weren't there in 1952.
I certainly wasn't.
And 1952, 53, very, very many people from England wanted to go to America because of all the urban rebuilding that was going to happen in England. And they realized they needed skills beyond the ones they got in the AA. And people said that the London School of Economics one, Holford School of Planning, was two nuts and bolts. Now, we made good friends with all of this traveling and looking at mannerism. We made good friends with the Smithsons. And, my sister was also at school at the AA. And she became a very good friend of theirs. And then Robin Middleton, who was at school with me at Witsen, he became like a member of our family. And then he and my sister lived together most of their lives. My sister's dead now. Robin is here in New York. I'm busy telling him he can't come and see me because he'll give me COVID. It's very sad because he's been like a brother. But anyway, so he was studying. Pefner went to South Africa and he lectured to South African architectural students. And he saw Robin there and he saw how special he was. Robin was the best designer we had in the school by far. And of course, what happened was he got to England and he went to work for the Euston Project there. And he met Architectural Design Review, and he left architecture. He went into history. And then Pevsner wrote to the president of Leeds University and said, you must give him a scholarship at Cambridge, a complete scholarship. And they did. So Robin became one of the first students of Pevsner. And so we went, and Pevsner was studying mannerism a great deal. And Pevsner had us for dinner because South Africans had been very kind to him. And that was very nice. And then also I took courses with Summerson. And Summerson were all about George and London and all of that. That's what got us the National Gallery. I went and talked to them about what I'd learned from Summerson and what we would likely do. And they loved it. Now they try to, if you can do anything to help about the National Gallery, you should try. It's breaking hearts of so many people. Yeah. And they don't realize that. And people tell us they love the building, not only architects. Venues are my thought vectors, come out very well in what we did in the National Gallery on all sorts of levels. And I'm the one saying to them, before you go on with it, have you worked out what the planners are doing in Trafalgar Square now? Or have you worked out what they're doing with the demise of theatres on Leicester Square? What are they doing for the new uses on Leicester Square? You have to understand that. You have to understand there's 1 million people crossing, not across Trafalgar Square, but on either side of it. Why would they cross across? There's nothing for them there. So they come out of Trafalgar Square. One set goes that way and one set goes that way. What do you want to do about all of that? And they're not thinking about any of that. I've been trained to think of that by the training I got at Penn from social planners, physical planners, people like Dave Crane, who grew up in Africa. So he planned a curriculum for us at Penn, which taught me things that other architects don't learn. I didn't take their urban design program at Penn, which gave you the required courses of architecture, the required courses of Penn, of planning. What was required of planning was an elective for architecture, you see. So you got a very, very thin training, probably the same kind Fred Marks got when he went to the school I suggested MIT found for developers. He went to a school I suggested they found. I was on their board of visitors. But what happened was he didn't learn much there, didn't have time. So I didn't do that. I took full planning course, full architecture, full architecture master's course, those 2 master's courses. And then I went on and taught there for a lot of years. And after a year, started collaborating with Bob. So people think that we joined forces when we married. We joined forces in 1950. We married in 1959.
Yeah.
And I taught Bob all about mannerism.
It's a lovely. Sorry, carry on.
No, say what you're going to say, because I want to get now to. You've got to focus. I've told you. The thing is, out of all of that, I've written the things you've seen, and then just recently I came across. I knew that Le Corbusier had. We went on a honeymoon, Robert Scott Brown and I, to Yugoslavia. And we hitchhiked through Yugoslavia. And it was unbelievable. And I've got lots and lots of photographs. I'm making a little book on it now. And it's a tribute to Robert, who the next year was killed in a car accident. But he'd done a year of planning with me. And it had been great. And people loved us. They said, if the one started a sentence, the other finished it. And then I went on teaching, you see, and they were very protective of me.
Yeah.
When I finished, I said, I'd like to teach a course that I see someone is leaving. He was from New Zealand and he was going home. It was that introductory course of planning to non-architects. So I began, and I got these young fighters like the one I told you about, who said, Denise, I knew what I was doing, and he's now photographing. There's another one called Carla Cohen. Her husband was a young lobbyist for the Democrats in Washington. She was the daughter of a big eye surgeon. She was very, very bright. She was round and roly-poly. And there were two like that, very motherly. And sometimes they'd have to mother me as well. Because I'd found somebody who said a really nasty thing to me. They found me weeping on my desk, take me for a drink at Smoky Joe's, the local bar. And but Carla, I found her in tears when I came into the studio. I put her in charge of getting all the drawings in for their jury on a big plan for Venezuela. And she said, Armando has gone back to first principles. And she starts weeping. And Armando, he was doing the first project, and he had regional science study and this, and he had a hefty, what's the word? You just can't finish your work. Block. He had a block about finishing. The morning of the jury, he's going back, no, we shouldn't have thought of it this way. We should have thought of it this way. So she's there weeping, and she says, I start weeping. She says, you're the professor. You should be, you should be comforting me, but I can't comfort her. Somehow she pulled it all over. Another thing is she's round and roly-poly. She's got a smock on because we use pastels then, no computers then. It was just covered with pastel colors as she'd be doing land use mapping. This person who's not going to be an architect, very bright. And also she was very protective of all the faculty. She'd go into their office and see a letter there, start reading it, and just stare at her and know what they want to do. So they did beautifully. And I didn't have to protect my students once. They could answer every question. And Terry Farrell was in that class.
Oh.
And Mark Emery. And so it was lovely, all of that. And then at the end, she didn't become a planner in the same way Jim Yellen, the one taking photos, he became a lifelong American diplomat in the State Department in Africa. He spoke French. He was in Angola a long time. He was sent down to work with Mandela because I'd shown him the pictures I had of Soweto. And we did a lot of work on self-help housing. We did a studio on it. He was in that studio. So all of that affected his career, but not the way we thought. And Carla started a bookshop in Washington called Politics and Prose. And Bob and I gave a lecture in that bookshop on learning from Las Vegas. And one of the heads of the Supreme Court was wandering around listening to the lecture while we were lecturing. And so that was fun too. And then later, Obama mentioned Politics and Prose Bookshop as the most important one in Washington. So it's nice stories of what my students did. And it's to do with working in a team, being highly idealistic, charretting together. You know, the atmosphere that architects create in a charrette. Planners never thought about that. And Robert Scott Brown was a great, he loved punning. And there was this little Michael Rabinowitz's, the Rubenstein, his name was, and he'd been an urban designer. And he was pretty talented architect, and he was in there, and he was working with a drawing board, and one that had a moving thing like that, and had a plastic along the blade of what's no longer a T-square, but just a thing that goes up and down. So as he ran the magic marker along the blade, the plastic thing, it squeaked very highly. And suddenly Robert calls out to him, Mike, squeak when you're spoken to. And you see, out of all of that, Paul Davidoff was the head. He was very young, and I was. And as Jim Yellen mentioned, we were the two youngest teachers there and the ones he learned the most from. And I would go and kibitz at his lectures And he was very noble to let me because it was the first time he ever lectured. And I was saying, you're all wrong about this. And I've done more planning and you haven't. And he let that happen. And it became like a yeshiva where rabbinical students study. They get so excited, they jump up on the desks, and the atmosphere was like that. And when Paul and I, who had offices opposite each other off a corridor in the basement, we just leaned back like this in the chair, start yelling at each other, and we'd find there were students there in the corridor listening. And we'd all go upstairs, and then we'd get a cup of coffee, and even more students, well, but not what the faculty wanted us to do, fought. And they all sat and listened. And then neither of us were reappointed because Luke Kahn got jealous. But anyway, so the point was that all of that, one day, Paul said there should be no studio, and they got rid of studio. All they did was do calculations. So you're all doing sums in here, and the whole thing just went like it. And Paul left, and he started another school in New York, and he didn't have a studio. And then I met with him one day, and I was talking with him. First of all, and in our school, he had a studio, ran a studio on the police department. Well, that went pretty well because people were asking a lot of questions and all. But he got to the other school and just doing sums and nothing else, and the whole school just stopped like that. And he came out saying I was wrong, it was right. That's putting things together by having interesting and telling questions. And so when we came back from Las Vegas, and I had planning students and movie makers and architecture students, I gave them a sketch design to do. But they were absolutely tied into the mapping they were doing. And you see what I say about mapping in that book. They got absolutely involved in it. And I said, you're going to spend 4 days, and it comes from Dave Crane, and it's good. You begin to get, while you go on doing the analysis, you now feel the landscape is going to mean that this whole area you can ignore because it's one great big cliff and you can never build on it. You see, it gives you some parameters you didn't have. But even if I said that to them, they absolutely refused. They went on with the mapping. We won't do this thing. Denise is giving us busy work to do. To me, it was such a triumph to have architecture students saying that design is busy work as opposed to analysis and things like that. They were really getting into this. Of course, they were in teams because they were listening to other people. You had ways of making them listen. Architecture students, they know when the jury is, they work out where they are on the list, and they only come in just before their project. And I said, you're going to fail if you do this here. You're going to have to be here to hear everyone if you're going to get the whole story.
Mm.
And they did. And then they defended each other's projects, which was at the AA, it was automatically done. If you had a friend and you thought they're going to have a tough time, you went to their jury. So I did that at Penn. And they were all in the big crit room. And Luke Kahn was there, and a man I didn't know, an old man. And I heard them saying things about the neighborhood districts. And I got up and I said, I didn't even say, may I interrupt? I just started to talk. So who's this redhead with English, redhead with an English accent talking? And I saw Luke Kahn with a look of triumph on his face. And it took me 15 years to realize what the triumph was about. But meanwhile, there I was, everyone telling one, who does she think she is? And the old man said, well, you know, at, what's it called, Rathbone or Rayburn or something, the first neighborhood garden thing, we did rather tend to want to keep cars away from pedestrians. Very modestly, he said all this. And there was Holmes Perkins absolutely flashing eyes with anger at how I was insulting his guests. It was a very funny thing. Go on now and ask me more things.
You talk, I suppose what I'm starting to understand, and I love this idea of these points in your life that have kind of played out through the work that you've written about, the way that you've taught, the way
I
that
did a
planned.
lot of architectural design, and I want to tell you that too, because no one believes I did any.
I do.
You know what they say? She writes very well. She knows a lot of history. What other some of the things? Well, she's a good office manager. I don't admit to anyone that I ran that office for the last 20 years, 100 people, and I ran it. But if I said that, they say, of course we knew she's not an architect.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that with the training I got in particularly the kind of systems land use planning that was being done at Penn when the ENIAC was there, and all those experts were there. And I took courses with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very human people.
Mm.
And I was the one who tried to do what Dave Crane was trying to do, determinants of urban form. And you'll find in the library at Penn, in the archives there, books which say determinants of urban form, forces that make urban form. So forces for, no, what's it? Functions, forces, and form. I've got a whole book of all the work I gave the students to do for one studio and all the readings about that. And I say, if you can put all of this together into the design, you will not be doing what Le Corbusier did. And then I found Ingraham, Catherine Ingraham, who wrote about how he said the donkey was a fool and the donkey did all the wrong things. And I said, no, the donkey was a functionalist and Le Corbusier was an ass, because Le Corbusier took the need for light, which came out of the health problems in Europe, about the problems of tuberculosis. And that was the real pressure why people were saying, we need light and sun in the slums. He made that light and sun reach up to the sky, which was hard for the building of slums. People tried, and then people didn't want to live in them. Some people did, but not very many. But that was one thing. And then the other thing is going up onto the roof and using the roof. And there you get Le Corbusier taking what he did in houses, beginning to apply it in cities. Now he's got to think of all the other things about cities, and he doesn't know what to do. So he just thinks, well, the schools will be here, the high-rise buildings will be on the hill because they look nice there, things like that. And then Robert and I went to Yugoslavia, and we followed the course Le Corbusier took in about 1911, I think it was. And there you saw all those donkeys we were talking about, you see. And it was true, they did build Paris and England, but mules and not only oxen did too. And then I discovered about some of the real things like central place theory. And it's very easy to teach architects central place theory without a single bit of computer in it. You start out and you say, make two crossroads cross, two busy crossroads. Here you are, two busy crossroads. You get their bodies involved. And then you say, now where would the high rise go? Oh, they say here. And they're right, because that's where most people will pass. Mm-hmm. And by the way, you look at the maps, and you can quite soon that. If you look at USGS maps, you can see all these patterns happening. And I've written a chapter of that in the book I told you about. So they look at that and they say, well, now, what about the ones that can't afford that rent? Well, they live around here. What about if there's a great big hill? Well, no one can live on that hill. You have to go, you have to have cars for that or something. And then what about the people who low-income people? Well, you can go and live in slums here, but more you're going to be living along here. So quite soon they've described urban place theory. And then you can go on in other ways to describe further in those all the things. I say, let's take a donkey now. And you have a donkey and you're in this hill town. And someone sent me a wonderful picture of a donkey in the hill town. Happened to be the one where Bob's father was born. And so we had Bob's father's house. We had the cobble street road. We had the little ramp on the street, which I've got on my African slides too, slight ramp. And people carrying a cord of wood on a donkey's back and a long thong to lead the donkey. I say, well, you don't find the long thongs in when you do excavation, because that leather all rotted, but that's what they use, and there you see a picture today. And so now, what does the donkey need? A place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to park, you could call it, a way to be helped up on the cobbles while the man walks up there. And you can, again, and you can take the whole thing and show it, and then you can say, on a moon trip, it'll need a place to be recharged, a place to stay, a place to, all of these things. And I said, when we had our Morgan car, Morgan three-wheeler, it was dated 1939, I think, and Robert and I bought one, and we went all over Europe with that. And we were using 1923 Touring Club Italiano. You see, I'm telling you about transportation, Sally, but I'm telling you about it now in the terms I recently used to use, so that I've seen students from a lecture in, a lecture in Mexico City I recently did. Not recently, it's a few years now. And I saw them all walking out of that lecture with their professors, all of them looking like this. And so, what was I saying?
We were talking about central place theory, and you were talking about the idea of planning. And I did wonder about this rather, this relationship in your training. It seems much more diverse, perhaps, than most training, certainly in Britain is now.
Well, you see, that's what Peter Smithson said. Yes, but Peter Smithson said that about the London School of Economics. They will give you a very focused route, and you won't get any other training at the AA. The AA is all doing, you see, I say, down with the Athens Charter. That was the problem. Le Corbusier, not knowing what to do, made up a set of things instead of going on and finding out what do donkeys do. Now, I say someone else did that. His name was von Thünen. He was a Prussian nobleman. I think it's 1813. And he rode his horse around his lands. And he saw where cows were grazed, walking distance from the abattoir. He worked out the cost of that transportation of the cow from there to there. He saw where potatoes were grown, rumbled in a wagon with oxen, or maybe with mules. Mm-hmm. And he saw all those other things. Where were sweet peas grown? They had to also get very quickly to market. And he worked out concentric circles, no roads put in there, but costs of transportation to them calculated. Yeah. And that's what he worked out, and then other people built on that. I say, what a pity Le Corbusier wasn't riding behind Le Corbusier on his, rather, von Thünen on his horse. You see, there's something called a postilion, two saddles on one horse. You have the one and then the other one on the back. Now, if he'd ridden on the back, he would have learned what von Thünen was teaching. But he didn't do that because he didn't live then. He was born 100 years later. So I'm trying to make it very human for them. And but then I go on, and we have from Robert Scott Brown's father-in-law, no, not father, stepfather. From him, we have the Touring Club Italiano maps of 1923. And on that, for very good reason, when you get into the Alps, the slopes on the roads are shown. And with our Morgan, we need that. So we drive along using these beautiful maps, and I love maps. I love enjoying all of that. And I'm directing Robert. And Robert was, in some ways, Robert was very brilliant, but he was also somewhat, what's the word? Dyslexic. And also, when it came to, if you say turn left, he'd turn right. So I always had to have two instructions. If you turn the way I wanted, and if you turn the way I didn't want. I guess quite a lot of also shouting from me with the last, but I had a means to get him back because I thought it was. But here we come on this map to a place where it says, now you find little highway, little road up here, you go here, you come here, you find a huge expressway, which wasn't on our map.
Yeah.
Then we had to start driving around to find the entrance and then recalculate from that. So we were very much involved with Morgans and that. And by the way, when you're in a Morgan and it's breaking down all the time, you spend half your life under it. And I learned an awful lot in French and Italian about car parts. And we had a great time having lunch with motor mechanics and lots of little kids around learning how he was fixing this car and things like that. It made a different kind of journey for us and a different kind of view. So when I got to Penn, and Chester Ratkin gave the urban economics lecture,
yeah.
and he talked about the IQ rates of different tribes, different types of people, different kinds of workers, and one of the things he told us that no one in the class would accept is that truck drivers have the same IQ levels as lawyers. And they all said that's ridiculous, except two people. One young woman who'd been hitchhiking in Colorado, and me. We were the two who said truck drivers. And then Robin Middleton later, he said that film, Salaire de la Peur, proves that too. These are very, very ingenious people who do those things. And so I could bring a different experience to those kinds of things that people were teaching, and it certainly livened things up. We had so many questions to ask Gans. Some of them he couldn't answer, like you see these great big car movers in Italy moving Fiats. So 3 stories of Fiats and a car mover. You see one going this way and 3 stories of the same Fiats going the other way. One's taking the child, the other's taking them away from the child. Said to Herb Gans, who was also teaching us that, you see, social, they called it social, I forget what, but one of the things we called it was side. It's like what's social physics. I think the social physics. Yeah. So what makes that happen? And he said, I just couldn't tell you. Now I've given a sort of survey, but when I then get into the office, it turns out that right at the beginning we were doing 2 classroom buildings for New York University at, I forget where, 2 big long buildings, and it was a Ed Barnes plan. And I had in South Africa, we'd been working with an Italian who was doing pre-stressed concrete, like logs, post-tension concrete they were. And he had a factory. And being Italian, he'd been a prisoner of war in Africa, and he came and settled there. And we knew a lot like that. And he was doing pre-stressed concrete, and he was bringing a gantry from Germany. And we had to design a shed like that. And he said, we'll build the whole structure. When it rains, we'll put the roof on. Very Italian. So Robert and I were doing it for him because he was a business friend of my dad. And and he had a wonderful way of making little notes and little diagrams of what he meant. And we said to him, we designed it, and I did butt joint in the glass, because that's what Robert was actually working in another firm. So I was doing most of it, sitting on their site doing it. And they had, everyone there spoke Zulu, and the one Italian spoke Italian and Zulu, but no English. I was all right. I could speak Italian with him. I knew little Zulu. And so it, we did the whole thing for him, and we showed him where the service pipes were coming in and all of that. And then we left, but they had the factory there and they were building there. And then a word came from Germany which said, we said, we said, put offices along the ground and then make a second floor of them higher up, because you've got all that space against the gantry.
Mm-hmm.
And then there came a message saying it's going to be far too noisy to put the offices there. You would have to put them somewhere else. But so I already had an experience of a very, very long building with a double volume on the other side. And that's the section we used for the school building that we did at my suggestion. And then I say the street makes the common spaces. And now let's see where those common spaces would be. Here's a stairway. If we take it up and then round and then up again, we can get a bench and another bench here, and that's where the main class, the main large hall is. And here are places to sit and wait. While you wait for one class to come out, the other sits and waits. And then you can, as you leave, you can meet each other here, and you can get talking about the lecture, and you can go on down this corridor, and we're giving you an outdoor amphitheater to sit and have conversations about what you were learning. This whole thing about how you learn from serendipity, from whom you meet, which is very much an urban thing, but it's a very much sought after thing now in the sciences, so that people can sit in the coffee room and then have boards there and they draw and they discuss with each other. And then where will the next major invention be found? At the lab bench or in the coffee shop.
Mm.
So we've done a lot of architecture like that. And so quite often I'm the one who starts out and says, here are the major access points from the town around, when we did this building for Toulouse, which is like a state capital.
Yeah.
And it was huge. And so we did that. And I was the first one to say the first plan should be how all these places around condition it. And we've got scale problems with them. Let's make the buildings 2 long slabs, which make a short cut a la Smithson's down the middle. And then from there, it won't worry the people who are living on medieval streets, but in modern buildings on the one side, and in the little shopping center on that side and on the other. We have a shopping center plan, which is a 20th century one, which we've introduced there. And then we also have where the canal comes, and there's also the big industrial road here, and where those people come. And then also we can make access points for people with parking. And I wanted a fruit and produce market along here, and the president said, no, you can't do that. We can have a ceremony, civic ceremony, none of that. So we had people parking their cars underground and coming here, but they put in a fruit and produce market in the basement, just where we wanted it, but we wanted it above ground. So all of these things came from basically my economics training.
Mm.
And then Bob has Bob was a fruit and produce merchant as well as an architect, and he was an owner of 15 trucks, and he knew about also the pilgrims marching places from church to church. He studied those and also delivery routes for his trucks. So he understood very well what I was talking about, all of these things. The person who was going to be the job captain, he wanted something else. He said you could fit six slabs down this way, and there's room for 4 slabs down this way. And I said, wait a moment, Fred, let's make a shortcut across the whole thing. And by the way, we found out later we'd missed one historic map, and then we found it exactly where we put the shortcut, and it was in building then, was where there had once been one. 1,000 years of shortcut there had been cleared away before we got there, and we put it back without knowing. And then the people all around could also get to it from the outside.
It's really interesting. It's this idea of context, isn't it? That you start to look at
Yes,
context in a way that's more
yes,
complex than that way that it's kind of thrown
yes.
about in architecture.
And you see, my dad um, was a developer. He didn't
Mm.
start as a developer. He went up north. He built a little African merchants place, you see. Indian people did that. Scottish people did that. He found a drunken Scotsman who sold him the concession to it. He got a big loan and he bought the concession. And then they built this wooden iron. And I've got pictures of those kinds of huts. They're just beautiful. And everything in it comes from Manchester, Czechoslovakia, Germany, you name it, it comes from those. And I've also taken pictures of African houses with paintings on the fronts of Western houses and gate numbers on them. This whole interplay in popular culture, which is so fascinating. So we've got all of that. But then my dad, after he did pretty well doing that, and they had one baby, me, and I'd already got, I forget if I got malaria or not. They thought I had. They said it's time to leave and go back to Johannesburg. And then he got there. He joined a cousin in another firm and helped make them do much better in the year he was there. But then he went on himself, and he became a distributor of movies. So we met an awful lot of American movie people. And then later than that, he became a developer. He bought property. He walked around. He was a flaneur. He walked around, having dropped us at school and before the office started, and he just had the thing of green thumbs for cities, green thumbs for gardens, and now I think everyone in the world says green fingers because Americans do. But I learned green thumbs. So green thumbs for cities, and he'd found places. This would be good for an office building. That would be good for an office building. And after the war, when the whole world came to Johannesburg because it was so full of gold, he built office buildings. And I, in fact, worked for the guy who built with him. And I was one of the ones who chose the stone color for one of his nicest buildings. It was a red, deep red stone with little shells in it. It was wonderful. And then pink priesthood. And I did the detailing of that. And then I went for another one. And the man said, well, we've got quite a few of your school friends working here. I said, I know, and they told me. And he says, but because you're his daughter, I'll pay you more. And I thought, oh boy. And that's what one of the reasons made me leave South Africa. Because I wasn't going to be given what I was worth and made to show what I could do. I was going to be treated differently, and that wasn't going to help me.
Yeah.
So I went and then I went and I worked for, who did I work for first? I worked for Frederick Gibbard.
Oh, did you?
Yes. And I did drawings for him, which were then put in, because South Africans were taught to draft well. And that was not for very long, but for a few months. And then the AA, I went and looked at the AA, which was very near. And I've just found, I'd been told, look, all they do is speak, laugh and play, and they don't do work, and it's not so well thought through. And I found I liked it. And then I said, well, I'm not coming here, of course, because I left my boyfriend in South Africa. Well, I said, just take the entrance exam. Well, when I took the entrance exam, I got in. And that already helped my self-esteem no end. And I decided that fate's pushing me.
Yeah.
So I went. But before I went and joined the AA trip to Sweden. And I met a whole lot of them there first. And that was fun too. And all sorts of interesting things that we did in Sweden. And then I went to school, and I had these difficult times of how do you start off in a new school. And but in the end, then there's 5 girls. When I first got into the studio at Wits, I said, what are all these men doing here? Because I knew my mother studied architecture. It had to be women's work. And so, but everyone at the AA, they used to come and try out their presentations on me. I couldn't do my work because they're telling me what they're going to do at the jury the next year. But it was really lovely, and people knew a lot. But I also, at that time, I could answer them a lot. And I did my thesis with Brian Smith, and it was very interesting too. I think, go on.
You mentioned this idea of popular culture.
Yes.
That's obviously something that's inspired a huge amount of your work and your analysis of work as well. And it, as you say, it ties in. I was wondering, what was it like in the so you were in London in the 50s? The rise of popular culture at that time, in that post-war period, the rise of kind of appetites for popular culture must have been almost irresistible. Do you feel like...
You see, I'd say I came with a huge right by seeing how Africans were treated in South Africa, and also by looking at African housing. But I must admit, I came back to look at African housing even more so when I'd been in England. But I was, you see, my dad was involved with public housing because he was helping to fund this Italian guy doing so. There were many, many ways. And also the South Africans were great socialists. And they were doing social research on minimum adequate standard of living in America, and coming back and using it in a big study department that existed at Wits University about studying African life. So I had many ways into that. And so I came already, and then we were all fighting apartheid. So that we all, university students were demonstrating like crazy. And so it was much more uproarious in South Africa. But I got to America and it was all more sedate again. But England was pretty uproarious, but not as much. But on the other hand, you see, very soon I got with the Smithsons and saw all what they were doing about English housing and how they were looking at it. And we were studying all of that. But my friends at the AA, who were the scholarship people, and it was only new that the scholarship people got scholarships there. And Brian Smith had the highest IQ in Luton, which is a funny thing to say. And that's why he got sent to the AA, because it was the best school. But he was very hurt by what he found there amongst upper class people. And so it was and I learned the English are very condescending have condescension for the manners of colonials and something else. Gardeners. Colonials and gardeners, the English show condescension for their manners. So I was a colonial.
It's true. My wife, who is an American, struggles with the manners of the English as well, a great deal.
Yes.
Not easy at all. I was just wondering. I mean, I don't want to take more of your time than seems fair, but it's been a lovely kind of journey through some of your through your origin story, I suppose, in a way, isn't it?
Yes. But you could also go and look at our buildings. You see the ones that I had lost. They're all the big ones, and like the University of Michigan. I was the one who did the campus plan, and then they had a very large complex developed called the Palmer Development. It was actually a life sciences center of the campus, and I saw the geography at first. There was a sunken lake there, and everyone was writing to say, I almost died when I crossed from the medical school to the main campus. And I saw you could take a bridge across without changing its level at all. And you would cross over the highway that was giving them problems and change the whole pattern of the campus there with that and 3 lab buildings. And I was the designer of that. Now, I had very good people doing my work in drawings, but I was the one who, what do you need here? What do you like here? And all of that worked through with that one. And then also the same thing with much of it at Toulouse, and also at Penn, making a new campus precinct at the center of that. I was the designer of the plan and then also of the buildings.
Yeah. Yes. It's this very interesting idea that you come up with, though, about the idea of communication, that mannerism is a method of communicating as well, that your architecture that you promote is about, in some way, talking to ordinary people about space, values.
Yes, but also one of the functions of functionalism is communication. In other words, when you have to let people understand how this thing works, so they know that they don't have to take that high street because here's a road that will take them. One of the things is you must make that road visible enough for them so they'll see that. That's one of the functions of road design is communication.
Yes. And popular culture's done that very successfully. I mean, that's one of the things about learning from Las Vegas and learning from Levittown and others of those studios you ran, is it's sort of getting young learners, students, to understand the things that popular culture, ordinary culture, can teach us.
Yes, and you see, Herb Gans wrote very well on that for students. And so we had his books and others, but also there were Eduardo Paolozzi was a good friend of the Smithsons. And it took me a long, long time to convince Bob that there were people dealing with popular culture before America, because all he knew was the ones we got to know. We got to know them personally in America. But Paolozzi wasn't quite the same. But when I finally showed him all the comic strips and things that were happening years before they happened in America, he agreed.
Yes.
But then what happened in America, they soon turned away. What happened in England, English people, like, do you remember John Winter?
Yeah.
He was my friend, and he married a school friend of mine from South Africa, who was an evacuee and sent to South Africa by the British government, and she became a close friend. And so he said, look, everything in America was wonderful to me when I first got there. We couldn't think of anything else. Now I don't believe that anymore. Now I think Baroque is more important.
Yes. It's a great and wonderful pleasure to have gotten to speak to you, Denise. I would love to carry on, but I feel like I've overstayed my welcome already, which makes me feel very very lucky. But I was wondering, maybe you could finish with some thoughts on. You've talked, for example, about the role of the digital in communicating a new mannerist architecture, and you talk about that in the paper that you suggested I read, architecture's offering to academe.
Of the digital?
Yes, you mentioned in there the possibilities of in one of the projects that you talked about. I do believe it's in there, or is it in Signs and Symbols, Signs and Systems? But there's this idea of creating an architecture which has some kind of digital qualities to it, as a way of communicating across two people rather than down two people in that high modernist fashion. And I was wondering if you had anything perhaps that might be how we might go about communicating with through contemporary architecture, with students and with the public.
But you mean communicating by computer?
No, communicating through our design work. Do the lessons that you learned in the mid-20th century and through your practice through the decades, do they still pertain? Are they still meaningful in
Well, you see, I'm trying to get at how are you defining. You see, sometimes I do a spoof or digital, like in one of my letters, it's called Planning the Powder Room, and it was written in huge anger because I was not given an associate professorship at that time because I was a woman. So I wrote this thing called Planning the Powder Room, and in it I did spoof mathematical double, what I forget what they're called in calculus.
Okay.
And I did a whole formula for calculating the length of a towel rail. You see, and it was all a spoof. And it's because I was angry, but people loved it. So I was saying, look, I want to be of aid to my fellow architects and in working out things like the towel. And here's a way of which, it was all spoof. But in actual fact, when I talked with Walter Izard, who's seriously, he is wanting to obtain world peace through computers. He was a Quaker, and he was an economic scientist. And what he did was talk about the space economy, and he used a lot of computers. But he could also teach with me in the room very nicely and say, well, Denise, what would you put here next? And so on. I didn't have to do the figuring of the math. And I just had to see, here's a black box and it comes in here and you should know where it will come out. You should know what it should do for you. And by all means, don't use it if you don't need it. But if you do need it, you should be able to use it, you see. And that outlook I thought was best. And he put me on his board because he said, we all know that there are many things other than payoff, measurable payoff, that people make decisions by. One of them is self-respect. Another is skill. And he began enumerating things that you couldn't measure that you still had to take account of. And how do you do that? And how do you deal with uncertainty? And he had funny ways of throwing a stick at something in a hole with a hole in it. And by the numbers of times it missed, you knew the length of the stick. So all of these ideas about, but I didn't relate those too well. What I said to myself is, get in your body the feel of how when this road is growing, it's growing because of the traffic on it, and then what effect is going to have on the geometry of the city around it. If it can set a directive here, there'll be a road with houses there. If it can't, if there's a big whole hill here and someone grades off the top of the hill, you get a road along the top of the hill, and then you get a little bit of housing. You see, feeling how these things germinate from what happens in the road system is one of the things I could talk about. But I'm not sure if I've really got to fundamentals. But if you find, see, America have what's called USGS maps, and it shows on them the roads and the different levels of roads. Then it shows on them in pink the development around the roads, but just blocked out in blocks. And then in certain places where the housing is new, they put in little purple teeny little rectangles, the new little housing in the new areas. And it gives you a feeling of how that whole thing is developing. And then there are the ones which are made on the moon, which shows some similar things. They show you the kind of topography of the moon. I must tell you one more thing in fairness to you. See, I say down with the Athens Charter, we can put Walter Izard in the Athens Charter. But at the same time, Le Corbusier in the end said, and I must admit, I am also a donkey. And what he means is, I love beauty. And he doesn't exactly say that, but that's what he means. He means, when I see something I like, I just like it.
Yeah.
And it's good to say that because we all do that. So that's it.
That's a great point to finish on. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Genuinely wonderful. Thank you, Denise, for this and all the work, and to Emma Brown for setting this all up too. Please do share this episode widely. It's quite a record. And of course, look out for more episodes of Heirs for Architecture, released weekly through the year. Thanks for listening.